tonight so that people who are watching on live stream can hear us. And at the end, hi guys, come on in. I'll leave time, of course, for exchange. We'll be able to talk together. But I will hand you all the microphone when you want to speak so that the live stream folks can hear everything that's going on. I want to start first by thanking you all for coming tonight. I always take very seriously how precious a resource people's time is and all the different things that you could be doing. And whether you're here tonight or whether you're here for the full cycle of all three talks, my deepest wish, and what that I hope everybody gets out of each one of these sessions, is that you walk out of here tonight with a really deeply practical takeaway, because I believe that philosophy, religious ideas, metaphysical ideas should be very concrete and should be very provable in the life of the individual. And I mean that in the plainest of terms. When I say an idea should be provable in someone's life, it should be reflected in your conduct. It should be reflected in your relationships. It should be reflected, I believe, in your ability to carry out your own highest ethical aspirations into the world. And if I or anyone else is giving a talk anywhere or writing an article or a book that claims to be providing philosophical ideas, and you don't feel that those ideas allow you to put the pedal to the metal within the very period in which you've heard them, I feel that your time hasn't been respected. And I'm so grateful for you being here. I hope some of you will be able to come to the cycle of 3 talks, because we're going to be here for 3 consecutive Mondays. Hey. And my wish is that these 3 talks do for you what Ideas of Mind Power have done for me, which is to say, give you a real direct philosophy and operating system from which to live, that give you a sense of your own possibilities, not only physically and intellectually, but as a being who has a life that, in addition to the physical and the intellectual, also has a non-physical component to it. And I'll be talking more about that this evening and over the course of these 3 talks. The question of whether we have, as part of our ability to see through our plans in the world, not only mind and muscle and emotion, but also a quality whereby our thoughts and these things that occupy our internal world are also causative, also contribute in a very concrete and measurable and definite way to the lives that we lead. I wanted to start off with a quick story that comes from just an extraordinary movie that I was watching last night with one of my younger kids. And when I tell you what movie it was, you may question my parental judgment, but it was a remarkable experience, and that was the horror movie Get Out, written and directed by Jordan Peele. Some of you have seen that. What an extraordinary, extraordinary movie. And I watched it with my 10-year-old son, who very much wanted to see it, and who very, very much grokked to everything that was going on in this movie. And for those of you who haven't seen it, I urge you to watch it. I urge you to go home and watch it tonight, if you don't mind watching horror movies at night. I think I'm a good parent, but I never quite got down the idea that you don't show children horror movies at night. So my son, no one slept in my household last night, including me. We were up all night. But I think it was being disturbed for a good cause. And I won't give away anything that occurs in that really, really extraordinary work of art, which I think everybody should see. But there is one moment in the movie that reminded me of what we're doing here tonight. And that in that moment, one of the villains in the movie, at a very, very tense and pivotal moment, turns to the film's hero, a man named Chris, and he says to him, "Chris, what's your sense of purpose in life?" And Chris goes, "What?" You know, he's feeling very threatened and very justly concerned about his physical safety. And here's this guy standing there asking him this seemingly genteel question, "What's your sense of purpose in life?" And as often happens, as I was watching this movie, and I'm sure you guys have all had similar experiences, you can be sitting there watching a movie, watching a show with your friends, and everybody's having his or her own internal experience of what's going on. And you hear a question like that, and although you're still wrapped up in what's happening on the screen, you stop and you ask yourself, as I did, how would I respond to that? You know, if I was in that scene myself, how would I respond to that? And I believe that we should all have a response to that question. What is your purpose in life? And it should be real, and it should be authentic, and it shouldn't be rehearsed, and it shouldn't be glib, and it shouldn't be clever, and you shouldn't feel obligated to respond to that question in an unserious setting. If somebody asks you that question in a bar or at a party or something like that, I think you're well within your rights to walk away from that person, because it's a deathly serious question, and our physical lives are finite. And I think it's a beautiful question. And again, it's a question to which all of us should have an authentic response, as authentic and as real a response as if I were to ask you right now, honest to God, where's your cell phone? Everybody knows where their cell phone is. You know, mine is in my front right pocket. Or if I asked you, do you have a fire extinguisher in your apartment? Where is that fire extinguisher? You might think, Jesus, I don't have one, and I really should. You know, but you would have an honest reaction to that question. Now, I don't want to supplant for anybody what that answer might be, but I can certainly say from my own perspective, and I think if this is true for me, I can't be the only one for whom it's true. I would say from my own perspective that my sense of purpose in life, and I think all of us to some extent can probably relate to this, is to be generative, to carry out and see through plans and ideas and enterprises in the world and within our own lives. And I think that aspiring to our highest ethical abilities, aspiring to our highest nonviolent abilities, and by nonviolent, I mean not doing something knowingly that disrupts the potential of another individual, or that humiliates another individual, or that humiliates or steals the potential of another person or group of people or community. Seeing through our highest nonviolent aspirations in the world, I believe, is our purpose in life. Being generative, carrying out enterprises and possibilities, transforming ideas and plans that form mental pictures within into something that's actual and real and concrete in the outer world. And that one's philosophy of life, if you have one, should be a blueprint by which you achieve that purpose. A purpose and a philosophy, I think, are two different things. My purpose is to be generative in a nonviolent way. And a philosophy is what leads you towards the fulfillment of that purpose. It's a blueprint, it's a map, it's an engine of ideas. The engine of ideas that I found that is most meaningful to me and to which I have dedicated my existence is the principle that thoughts are causative. That our thoughts actually concretize and outpicture in some measure in reality. My contention is, and I'll briefly describe the historical movement and the personas from which this idea sprang in modern life. My contention is that we don't live under one grand mental super law. I don't personally believe that because I haven't had experience of that. But I do believe that amidst the many laws and forces under which we live, including laws of physical limitation and mortality, these bodies do decline and go away. That's not the only thing going on in life, but that's certainly one thing. Under the many laws and forces under which we live, the mind represents one extraordinary influence of causation, and it should absolutely be a useful, explored, and experimented with aspect and facet of one's existence, exactly in the same way your intellect, your physicality, your emotions are an acknowledged and understood part of your existence. The philosophy that I'm describing will go under various names. I'm laughing because I'm never quite satisfied with any of the names, and I haven't come up with one that I think is uniquely satisfying. Sometimes this philosophy will be called New Thought, a philosophy to which some of us here are dedicated, and we're comfortable using that term. People will use terms like the power of positive thinking, or the secret, or the law of attraction. I've sort of half-jokingly used the term applied transcendentalism, and then I thought, no, my Aunt Lois will never use that term, you know. And part of the reason why it's difficult to talk about the set of ideas that I'm going to cover in part tonight and over the cycle of these talks is that serious people, for probably the past 100 years or so, have been taught to feel that notions of positive thinking, law of attraction, the secret, and other names that I could come up with are a kind of immature philosophy, kind of a childish philosophy. Serious people in media and in academia very routinely refer to these things in a kind of disparaging way. The other night I was speaking to a reporter from Politico who wanted to write a story about Donald Trump as this kind of like horrible bastard child of the positive thinking movement. And we engaged in a long discussion, and I talked about all these subtleties and all these different ideas and all these different possibilities and questions and so on and so forth. And I said one thing to him that stuck, and as the words exited my lips, I knew it was going to stick, and I knew I would see it in print. And then I said, you know, well, Donald Trump is really the Frankenstein monster of positive mind philosophy. And our whole 60-minute conversation, and it was 60 minutes, boiled down to that one thing. And I knew that, and I understood when you're talking to a reporter, 9 times out of 10, that person already has his story written in his head, and he's really just coming to you for color commentary. And if you don't like that, don't talk to reporters, because that is the fact of life. And his attitude, and I understand the attitude because I've grown up with it and I've been around it, and there are many people, including people who I know on the spiritual path, who have the attitude, is that it seems like a, you know, Dorothy, click your heels and you're in Oz kind of philosophy. It seems like a philosophy that's simplistic. It seems like a philosophy that belongs to inspirational literature that should be sitting on my grandmother's nightstand somewhere. We don't like to talk about the power of positive thinking in settings where we're supposed to be talking about existentialist ideas and deep metaphysical ideas and so forth and so on. And I grok to all of that. I understand all of that. But I keep revolving back to the central idea of the mind's power because I believe it works. Because I essentially and truly believe that it works. And I believe that it's probably the central and the most important metaphysical insight that we as modern people are receptors of. And I think that that fact shines through so many different fields of study. In fact, over the past 150 years, our conceptions across the hard sciences, medicine, various fields of therapeutic and cognitive study, theoretical physics, have continually deepened and expanded the question of the mind's abilities. That question has never receded. It has continually expanded, and it continues to expand in our generation and during our lifetime. Now, this idea that the mind is causative, I refer to as a modern idea, but you can find its roots spiritually throughout the world because people across history have had parallel insights. One of the most alluring places that this insight or this contention appears is in what is known as the Hermetic Literature, which was a collection of Greek, Egyptian, magical, and philosophical literature that was written down in the Greek language in the city of Alexandria in the decades immediately following the death of Christ. At that time, Egypt had fallen under Roman military domination, and the ruling class in Egypt was Hellenic, was Greek. And as it happened, some of the figures from within the Greek ruling class, including the great Cleopatra, were deeply enamored of ancient Egyptian religious practices and did what they could to revive those practices which had withered under Roman military rule. And a cluster of Egyptian scribes a cluster of Greek scribes working with Egyptian religious figures, priests, practitioners of mystery religions, wrote down aspects of ancient Egyptian oral tradition in the Greek language. And they attributed these tracts, these written statements, to a mythical man-god who they referred to as Hermes Trismegistus, or thrice greatest Hermes, which was a title of veneration that the ancient Greeks gave to Egypt's god of intellect and writing, Thoth. The Greeks believed that Thoth was greater than their own god Hermes, or the god that was later called Mercury, and now presides over Grand Central Terminal and many places here in New York City. And so they referred to Thoth as thrice greatest Hermes, Hermes Trismegistus, 3 times as great as Hermes. And they basically affixed the name Hermes Trismegistus to these literary tracts that they wrote, which became very popular during the Renaissance, and then a debate over the historicism and the antiquity of these tracts tended to lead to the Hermetic literature becoming unpopular for many centuries, which is why we don't have a lot of good translations of this Greek Egyptian literature today. We have a few, and we're doing better in this generation than we did in previous ones. But one of the central ideas that exists in this late ancient Greek Egyptian literature is that the mind, the human imagination, that quality within us that can devise mental pictures, is a capillary, is an extension of the highest force of creation in the universe, God, the all, the great creator. And that insofar as the individual is created in the likeness of the highest, the individual can also, within his own sphere of existence, in his own plane of existence, act as the highest does. That one's thoughts are a formative, creative tool that actually concretize and outpicture in reality. Now, that is one ancient source, among others, for these ideas. But the notion that the mind has creative capacities entered modern life through a much more circuitous route. It's nice to think that because a set of ideas existed in antiquity, anybody expressing them in the modern world must be drinking from those waters. But the truth is, intellectual history is a very broken line. And it's not a neat family tree, but it's a very broken, very fractured family tree. One of the ways that this notion that thoughts are causative, that I hold so dearly, came into modern life was through the efforts of a self-styled Viennese occult healer named Franz Anton Mesmer, who was a popular and somewhat scandalous figure in Paris about a decade before the onset of the French Revolution. And Mesmer contended that by putting people into these kind of trances, which were then called mesmeric trances, but which we today refer to as hypnotic trances. And it's funny, actually, I hadn't made the connection, but in the movie Get Out, hypnosis plays a very central and sinister role, actually. We haven't lost our fascination with this idea that you could place a human being into a trance state and you have access to this whole incredible landscape of psychology that we don't necessarily experience when we're doing our laundry or adding up figures on a column, but that represents this vast, extraordinary, mysterious, uncharted territory of the psyche. So Mesmer blows into Paris, and he maintains that he can place people into a trance state, and from this trance state, he can manipulate this invisible etheric fluid that runs through them and that animates all of life, which he referred to as animal magnetism. That's where the term animal magnetism comes from. And he maintained that by manipulating this animal magnetism, this invisible etheric fluid, he could cure diseases, he could cure mental disorders, he could cure physical maladies, and he was the rage of Paris for years and years and years. He was eventually somewhat discredited in a report that was requested by King Louis XVI, who was deeply suspicious of Mesmer, partly because, and these things just get lost to history, partly because if all human beings, if Mesmer's thesis were said to be correct, if all human beings are animated by this invisible etheric fluid, doesn't that say something radical about the plainness of human equality? If you're in pre-revolutionary France and some guy is saying we're all united by this invisible etheric fluid, well, that's not only true for the guy working somewhere in the fields and for the nobleman seated in his palace, but it's also true for enslaved people who are being forced into servitude in the West Indies and other areas where France is maintaining these vast sugar plantations. And in fact, and I write about this in my book, Occult America, and in another book called One Simple Idea, which is about the positive thinking movement, there were people active in the abolitionist movements in France and in the U.S. who were big admirers of Mesmer because they believed that he had unlocked a key to human equality. Unlocked a key to human equality. We are all just mere extensions of something else, something non-physical, something that you can't see or touch. And Benjamin Franklin, who at the time was ambassador to France, chaired a commission for Louis XVI that condemned Mesmer. Although ironically enough, the Marquis de Lafayette, who was the French hero of the American Revolutionary War, was a student of Mesmer's. And he introduced by letter George Washington to Mesmer. And Washington and Mesmer had correspondence together. And this correspondence exists in the Library of Congress. I write about it in my book, One Simple Idea. There's another book called Mind as Builder, which I just published, where I wrote about it. And it's very interesting. You know, I mean, most people who invoke the name Mesmer, if they've heard of him at all, think of him as this, you know, fringe occult weirdo who was popular for a time in Paris until he was discredited. He had correspondence with Washington. He asked Washington's permission if he could come to America and open these universal academies of understanding, and Washington wrote back to him and said, yeah, why not? You know, he wasn't particularly committal on the matter, but his best friend, the Marquis de Lafayette, was close with Mesmer, was a student of Mesmer's, and these figures that seem so fringe weren't always necessarily so fringe. They were figures that divided people's loyalties, they divided people's affections. So this was Franz Anton Mesmer, who claims that he's putting people into hypnotic trances, manipulating this animal magnetism, curing them, teaching them to speak foreign languages. People are going into these trance states, and sometimes they're reporting out-of-body experiences. They're speaking in tongues that they don't have any evident ability to know, that they didn't grow up with. They're describing events in other countries and across the ocean, and all these strange things are going on. Now, as often happens when somebody makes an innovation or a finding, it's usually the next generation that refines what that person did. And that was certainly the case with Mesmer. Mesmer's brightest students, some of whom trickled to America in the wake of the French Revolution, Mesmer's brightest students thought, you know, the master seems to be right about these effects that are being felt when people are put into trance states, when they're manipulated under these mesmeric trances, or what we today would call hypnotic trances, the term that became popular in the late 19th century. But the best of his students thought, maybe there really isn't this invisible etheric fluid. Maybe there's some other mind. Maybe there's some other quality of human thought that we haven't perceived. And that's what he's actually manipulating. And this other quality of thought is what's curing diseases, curing maladies, reducing these crippling mental or emotional blocks that people have had for years. And they began to experiment with what would later be called the subjective mind, the subliminal mind, and eventually the subconscious mind or the unconscious mind. The earliest glimmers in the modern world of there being the existence of this unseen but enormously powerful causative, determinative mind that we today, sort of in this very domestic way, refer to as the subconscious mind, as if we think we know what it really was or is, began with the experiments of Franz Anton Mesmer in modern life. In modern life. People find that extraordinary, but there's an absolute family tree of ideas there. An absolute family tree of ideas. It wasn't until the 1890s that psychologists like William James and Frederick Myers began to use the term subjective mind, began to codify psychological language and sort of domesticate this idea. But it was Mesmer and really his students, his next generation of students, that said, something is happening here. Something is being manipulated here. And Benjamin Franklin himself said in the report condemning Mesmer that he wrote for Louis XVI, all these cures that are getting talked about, all these maladies that are being cured, the physical effects, it's all in the imagination. It's all in the imagination. That was said as dismissively 250 years ago as it gets said today without anyone asking the question, well, then what is the imagination? What is it? And we still do this today. We still do this today. You will see people, journalists, academics, others, refer to something, some physical effect, as being all in the imagination. Well, what is the imagination? That was the extraordinary question that the Franklin Commission left dangling in the early 1780s. It raised and left unresponded to one of the most extraordinary modern insights and questions that has followed through to our own day. If these cures are in the imagination, then what is that faculty? What is that vehicle? Now, Mesmer's students trickled to America, a few here and there, and people began to experiment with these ideas. One of the people who experimented with these ideas was a New England clockmaker by the name of Phineas Quimby, which is a name that's probably familiar to some of you. Quimby was a clockmaker from the state of New Hampshire, later moved to Maine, who in the late 1830s was suffering from tuberculosis. And tuberculosis in America at that time was all but a death sentence. Something that a lot of people don't understand, and this was true of American medicine throughout the 19th century, really right up until the dawn of the 20th century, medicine was in an abysmal state in the U.S. It was the one area of the sciences where the U.S. continually lagged behind Europe. And this was true right up and through the 1890s. If you lived in a frontier territory like Tennessee or something like that, you would never come into contact with anyone who remotely resembled a practitioner of modern medical practices. I'm not saying things were infinitely greater, in Ireland, for example, but the likelihood is you could get somebody to set a broken bone. There was some kind of palliative care. There were botanical remedies. People knew how to dress wounds. Throughout much of America, things that you would think could be taken for granted as rudimentary modalities of medicine were unavailable. Most physicians didn't want to travel across the Atlantic to the American colonies or later to the nation of America. They were fairly well treated in Europe, and there were really no teaching hospitals in the country. There were probably about 3 up through most of the mid-1800s in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. And the state of medical care was abysmal. People were using leeches and bleeding and weeping wounds and things that we associate with the medieval period. So Phineas Quimby is suffering from tuberculosis, and he has absolutely nowhere to turn for appropriate medical attention, even palliative care. He's being given toxins and poisons, mostly in the form of mercury, which causes excessive salivating and sweating and bleeding from open wounds, which physicians at the time believed was a tonic. They believed that open wounds and like flushing the body, flushing the bodily fluids was a kind of tonic. So you had a figure like Quimby, and this was true of so many people at the time, who had absolutely nowhere to turn. And a friend of his suggested that he try this ancient Greek remedy of vigorous horseback riding. The ancient Greeks believed that vigorous horseback riding could serve as a cure. And feeling at least it couldn't do him any harm, which was more than could be said for his visits to the doctor's office, he went on this very raucous carriage ride one day through the New Hampshire countryside. And Quimby found that after this carriage ride, not only had the effects of his tuberculosis lifted, but he felt better for some time thereafter. And he began to reason that there was this intimate connection between the emotions, riding in the carriage had gotten him kind of all worked up, and one's state of physical well-being. And Quimby came to believe that there was this absolutely concrete line of connection between your feeling state emotionally and your physical state. And he became well known as a mental healer throughout the New England area, where he worked for several decades before his death in early 1864. And many people left behind letters and diaries and articles where they talked about receiving these mental treatments from Quimby, in which he was able to convince people that their sense of well-being was in their belief. And people reported cures and breakthroughs and success rates anecdotally, personally, that were as dramatic as anything that got recorded by people who were working with Mesmer. So it was through Quimby's way of thought that you had the beginnings of what became a kind of mental healing movement in America. And this branched out in many, many different directions. One of Quimby's students was a woman named Mary Glover Patterson, who later became known to history as Mary Baker Eddy, who was the founder of the religion of Christian Science, which for many years was one of the most bounding and popular new religious movements in America. She had deep differences with Quimby, but she had this essential belief that your mind, the mind that you're using right now, is a kind of mortal instrument of delusion, that we're all lost in the matrix, so to speak. In fact, I think if Mary Baker Eddy were alive, she probably would like the movie The Matrix. She believed that was the human situation, that our minds are actually instruments of delusion, and there's only one great higher mind of insight and truth, and that's the mind of God. And that if you can dissolve your sense of possessing this little separate mind and allow yourself to be cleanse the doors of perception, as William Blake put it, allow yourself to perceive higher reality, you will be permeated by this higher mind of God in which you live and function, in which there's no violence and there's no prejudice and there's no sickness. So that was Mary Baker Eddy's contention. That was one direction in which this mental healing, prayer healing revolution began to travel. Other directions had to do with people who believe that it's not that the mind is this corrupt, misleading influence, but that the mind is, as it was said in the Hermetic literature, kind of a capillary of the divine, kind of an avenue of the divine. And that if you could come to realize that, if you could come to realize that the more you could be permeated by some sort of divine influence or some kind of higher metaphysical law, your own thoughts would become potent and active and muscular and would have the ability to actually carry out and see through things in the world, including physical wellness, and later, as Americans like to remake ideas over and over and over in ever more practical directions, in areas of wealth, in areas of relationship, in areas of business success. And as America entered the 20th century and there was a consumer culture bounding and popping up everywhere, the Sears catalog started to enter people's homes, railroads were connecting towns and cities, department stores began to open, people were moving off of farms and moving into office jobs or industrial jobs, the stock market was being formed and money could seem to arrive from out of the ether, Americans began to grok to this idea not only as an instrument of health, but as an instrument of wealth and prosperity and material well-being and success. And that really became the American philosophy. That really became the American outlook. It unites and divides us today. It unites and divides us today. All the popular literature that you can name, all the self-help literature that gave birth to the vast network of self-help as it exists today, grew out of that one central idea, what I've just been describing. How to win friends and influence people, the power of positive thinking, think and grow rich, the science of getting rich. A lot of it was an emphasis on money. A lot of it was an emphasis on materiality. This philosophy, this outlook, this notion that our minds are somehow these secondary engines of some higher power, it unites and divides us in all kinds of ways. It's the basic spiritual outlook that you'll find in New Age retreat centers and spiritual centers and evangelical mega ministries like the kind that Joel Osteen runs. And to my everlasting shame, it's exactly the atmosphere in which Donald Trump grew up, at Marble Collegiate Church on Fifth Avenue, which his family attended since he was a little kid. The Power of Positive Thinking is one of the only books that Trump ever talks about having read. I don't know whether he read it. How many of you here have read The Power of Positive Thinking? Okay. Oh, you did? Oh, we'll talk about that a little more. You know, The Power of Positive Thinking surprises people when they read it because it's a much more Christian book than people expect. There are sometimes New Age folk or secular folk who read The Power of Positive Thinking and they, get like an allergy and they break out because Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote it, his genius was to take all of this kind of magical material, and he was very versed in it, and he uses terms that are a leaf directly out of Mesmer in that book. He'll refer to magnetism and an attraction between bodies, and that it's been scientifically proven that one body exerts a magnetic pull over another, and he'll talk about vibrations and music of the spheres and all this occult material, but he reprocessed it through scriptural references that the church-going public would be comfortable with. That was Peale's genius as a communicator. Those are the sermons, and that's the book that a young Donald Trump grew up on. And this guy from Politico the other night was saying to me, isn't it true that Trump is the first self-help president? And I said, no, that's not true that he's the first self-help president. To my mind, actually, the first self-help president was Ronald Reagan, who also grew up on this stuff and who would routinely say things like nothing is impossible and that man can achieve things that surpass what he's told are fact, and that if a person can fix something in his mind, he can go beyond the limitations that he's been brought up believing. Reagan would talk about these things in his speeches and in his essays and so on. It was really Reagan who was the first self-help president. But the fact is, however one looks at these movements, they left such an indelible mark on every facet of our country that Trump is, I think, the first president since Reagan who was able to get elected without singing tributes to brighter tomorrows, without having optimism as part of his central, at least public outlook. Trump is not an optimist. His point of view is based on exclusion. When he says make America great again, he's referencing who we want to get rid of, not who we want to embrace. So he's the first president, ironically, since Reagan, to whom singing paeans to brighter tomorrows is not part of his playbook. And I personally find that very alarming. Now, I've talked about positive thinking. I've talked about this contention of thought causation as being the kind of American creed, the closest thing we have to an American creed. For some people, that is a source of grief. For some people, that says that our creed is delusive, and a case in point is this violent, unattractive figure who occupies the presidency who says he grew up on it. Now, I have mixed feelings about what I'm saying. Because the fact is, if it were Barack Obama who went to Marble Collegiate Church, a figure who I hold in esteem, I'd be really happy. And I would say, isn't that great? Isn't he just a living testament to the potency of everything that I'm talking about? And Obama did cite Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance, as a central influence in his life. And self-reliance is also a transcendental outlook that figures into this philosophy. So there's a part of me that thinks I should probably bow my head in deference somewhat when people raise this point that Trump seems to be the kind of shit end of the stick that I'm talking about here, and maybe I bear some moral responsibility, and people who think like me bear some moral responsibility for the fact that so narcissistic a figure could take advantage of this philosophy. And I think about that. I think about that. But I will say this, and this is what didn't make it into the Politico article, even though I talked about it at great length. I started off this talk this evening, by saying that to be really purposeful in life, one must be generative. One must be generative. And that an act of creation that excludes and that shuts down and that limits the potential of other people is not creative, it's violent. It's by its very nature violent. And part of the reason why I love New Thought philosophy, including the deeply flawed Norman Vincent Peale, is because it is in fact grounded in a set of gospel ethics or universalist religious ethics. If you can reference your ideas, whether or not one agrees with the theology, to the Gospels or to the Beatitudes, you can reference it to other universal religious works, the Tao Te Ching, the Bhagavad Gita, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, the Psalms. New Thought has always, since its inception in modern life, been grounded in a kind of nonviolent gospel ethic, which is why, I suppose, I grok to New Thought as opposed to other traditions that might have an ethic that asserts the primacy of the true self, but without any kind of guardrails that mediate relationships between people. Now, look, I don't want to try to unpack too much here, but you could say that Ayn Rand, for example, promulgated a secular version of some of the things I'm talking about. I think of Ayn Rand as an extraordinary person. I don't agree with her philosophy. I think she had too great a reaction to the statist experience that she grew up in, and as a result, she sought replicating itself everywhere, so that if somebody proposed, a mutual dental plan, Ayn would see in that Stalinism just in its acorn form. I think that's wrong. Take Aleister Crowley, for example, the great British occultist. Crowley, as far as I'm concerned, had a beautiful aesthetic. Crowley was intellectually better developed than Norman Vincent Peale and some of the people from within the positive thinking world. But I think Crowley was so apt to rely upon the fact that the cultivation of a true self in turn brought with it a set of natural ethics, that he overestimated his own ability and the ability of other people to really unpack and decide where something was coming from a true self and where something was coming from a more desperate, narrow self, which I think is probably what you have in the figure of a Donald Trump. I don't think there's a true self there. How can you tell? How can you tell? I think you can tell this way. When a person is acting from some true integral sense of self, they tend to be independent. They tend to leave other people alone. But people who are always placing burdens on others, bullying them, harassing them, humiliating them, and in turn who themselves are very easily humiliated, which Trump certainly is. I mean, somebody looks at him the wrong way and he's firing off 5 tweets at 5 o'clock in the morning. That can't be coming from a more authentic self. The ability to determine whether I or you or anyone around you is acting from a self that's moving in the direction of true north, that's moving in the direction of something integral and real, correlates to their ability to leave other people alone. When people are acting in violence, when they're making demands on other people, when they're humiliating other people, when they're limiting other people, or when they're persistently complaining about other people, then they're acting from something smaller and uglier and narrower. So in that sense, I don't in any way see Trump as an authentic branch from this tree. I see Trump, as I said the other night, as a kind of Frankenstein monster wandering very dangerously around the countryside, having been a kind of schismatic, misconceived off-ramp from this philosophy rather than a real expression of it. However, even in saying that, there are times where I feel I should bow my head in silence, because it's not a small thing. It's not a thing that should be dealt with in a facile way, that Trump attended Marble Collegiate and grew up reading The Power of Positive Thinking. That's not a small thing. And as much as I've been frank with you about my deepest feelings on the matter, there's a part of me that feels like I also should be silent at certain times on that matter and sort of live with that and ask myself ethical questions about that. Now, I've mentioned tonight a lot of popular literature. I've referenced authors like Norman Vincent Peale, Dale Carnegie, Napoleon Hill, a whole range and cohort of folks who took the mind power contention and reprocessed it for a very popular audience. Now, I mentioned the Hermetic literature, to which I have a very, very deep devotion. There's a little occult book that was published in 1908. It's a little book physically, but it's really an epic book called the Kabbalion, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, which is an attempt, I think successfully, to marry some Hermetic ideas to New Thought or positive mind ideas. That's an exceptional book. But many of the things that I've mentioned to you, especially when I reference Law of Attraction and The Secret and so forth, they're very popular literature that tends not to be seen as really deserving of posterity, really deserving of the attention of serious, searching people. But I have to be frank with you. I really believe, and I say this from years of search, that the authors of a great deal of that popular literature had an extraordinary instinct in the right direction, an extraordinary instinct in the right direction. And I personally find myself returning to that literature again and again and again in that belief that they had ideas and anecdotes and insights that have proven deserving of posterity. They were wrong in certain ways, I believe. And in fact, this is something I'm kind of trying to deal with today. And this is, in many regards, the whole point of tonight's presentation. I think that the positive mind movement has fallen into a kind of childish tone, into a kind of unquestioning tone. I write about this in my book, One Simple Idea, and I have a new book coming out called The Miracle Club in fall of next year, where I write about this much more explicitly. I think the movement has failed to examine its own premises. I think there's no reason to believe, and it's not necessary to believe, that we live under one mental super law, in order to experiment along the lines that I've been describing. And next Monday's talk, I'm going to be getting into some very, very concrete methods that we can experiment with together and try these things out in our own lives. And let me tell you, when I say experiment, I don't mean go away for 20 years and come back together and let's say, did you have a better Monday? I mean, I believe that these things should be palpably felt within one's life almost immediately. And I take that very, very seriously. And I take your time very seriously and your needs very seriously. I believe that the positive mind movement has been burdened by a childish language, a childish aesthetic, and, as I mentioned, an unwillingness, an inability to re-examine some of its own premises. People are always saying things to me like, well, if you believe all this stuff, then, what about the earthquake in Haiti? What about the hurricane in Puerto Rico? What about the wildfires in Northern California? Is that those people's fault? No, it's not their fault. Because we live, and I'll talk more about this next week, we live under multiple laws and forces. Mortality alone tells us that. I mean, these bodies are going to go away. A law, to be a law, needs to be consistent. So if there is some mental law going on, if Mesmer's contention, however his vocabulary differed from ours, if his contention was correct, then why? Why does there seem to be this schism? How come you meet a person who has a zest for life and they get struck down by some terrible accident or disease? That happens. It's absurd to say that doesn't happen. And I call out my friends in the New Thought movement and the positive mind world who would suggest that, oh, well, that person's thought patterns were such and such, or that person's subconscious mind wished for it, or, when people are at their desperate point, hanging onto their philosophy by their fingernails, they'll suddenly reference karma. And it's like, well, wait a minute, karma is a very epic concept. You can't just bring that in to plug gaps. It's not caulking or bubble gum that you bring in to plug gaps when your philosophy doesn't work. The fact is, yes, a law to be a law has to be consistent, but we experience consistent laws differently all the time because we don't live under one set of circumstances. Doesn't mean they're not real. Gravity is a law, but you're going to experience gravity radically different on the moon, where you can jump 10 feet in the air, than you would on Jupiter, where it would crush you, because gravity responds to mass. So there's no gravity in space, so to speak, where there's a vacuum. The greater the mass, the greater the effects a living thing experiences from gravity. The law hasn't changed. It's perfectly consistent. But there's other things going on. Why couldn't it be that way with our minds? Why couldn't it be that way with our minds? You do a placebo study, and you find that you give somebody a transparent placebo, and it works for one person, and it doesn't work for another person. Or you give somebody some potent medicine, some medicine that's supposed to have some actual chemical, biological value. And to one person, you talk up the medicine, and you say that, this is really going to be very effective. And placebo studies have found that the person who receives the positive information about the active drug, as opposed to an inert substance, will actually do better with the active drug. These are things that are going on in placebo studies at universities right now. None of this is exaggeration. So we see, and I'm only scratching the merest surface, the merest surface. We see that the mind does have biologic effects, but they're not always going to be experienced consistently or the same way at the same time, and nor does any other natural law. Nor does any other natural law. If I was to set a piece of paper on fire right here, the paper would combust at a fixed degree of temperature. If it's a piece of paper, it'll be 451 degrees. But whether there's air blowing from this vent is going to affect how quickly or how slowly the paper burns, or if the air is blowing from the vent too strongly, the paper might not combust at all. The flames may not be able to receive any oxygen. So things that we experience as natural laws have variances all the time because we live under many laws and forces. So to experiment with these ideas, which we're going to do very concretely next week, and I'm also going to give everybody a special gift next week. I'm being absolutely shameless. If you come back, you're going to get a gift. And it's going to be really good, not just some junk. It's not going to be like a postcard for 10% off a Mitch Horowitz book or something like that. I'm not tricking you. I'm shameless, but I'm not duplicitous. You're going to get a really good gift. So next week we're going to experiment with some of these things very, very concretely in a very hands-on way. But what I want to say to you is this. You shouldn't let anybody tell you, and you shouldn't be burdened with the kind of this mental entry fee, that the only way that the mind's causative properties can be understood to be real is if they're perfectly consistent all the time, as if we live under one mental superlaw or one law of attraction. There's absolutely no reason that I've ever encountered in my own experience, in the history of this thought movement, in the experience of the world as it's lived, that that has to hold true in order for you to go out and experiment with the formative apparatus of your mind. You don't live under one law. I don't live under one law. We live under multiple laws and forces. But it's extraordinary enough that the causative properties of the mind could be one among those forces. And think of the possibility that that gives you, the landscape of experiment that that opens you up to, if brain and muscle and the happenstance of accident are not the only things under which we live, but you have some other organ, you have some other tool that you can use to navigate toward purpose, whatever it may be for you. And you have that available to you. You have that available to you. But it only makes itself known by experiment, which is why everything I do is a kind of call to experiment. The only way a religious or an ethical or a psychological idea can be felt in your life is through the experience of your own personal conduct and relationships. No one can dictate for you the reality or unreality of this idea. And that's what's so beautiful about it. It's your private domain of experimentation. You don't have to seek anybody's permission. You don't have to join anything. You don't have to buy anything. You don't have to declare fealty or membership in anything. You have this exquisite possibility. And I don't want to get excessively dramatic, but in a sense, if you leave here tonight saying to yourself, look, I do have the capacity to experiment along these lines, and we're going to be continuing this, it really does connect you in some way. It really does connect you in some way to seekers from the furthest reaches of antiquity, from the earliest primeval strivings of men and women to be more than what they were told is simple fact. The reason why the Hermetic literature is work toward which I feel so drawn and which I love so deeply is that it's one of the few places that we modern people have that is a repository of certain ideas from primeval Egyptian antiquity. I'm not saying that those ideas have come to us uncorrupted or uninterrupted. Everything gets corrupted and interrupted. I mean, the astrology that we practice today isn't like the astrology that the ancient Babylonians practiced, but it's what we have. And things come to us sometimes through broken and frayed threads. But there is a thread nonetheless. There is a thread nonetheless. And if you choose to experiment with these ideas, which I urge you to, it does connect you to our most primeval ancestors who had these ethical strivings of their own, who had these wishes of their own to know, is this all there is? Is what I see all there is? Or is there some other life, some unseen life? And can this life be experienced through my own sense of awareness? The beautiful thing about this movement, this mind power metaphysics, especially as it entered American life, especially as it was expressed in the kind of religiously experimental atmosphere of which Phineas Quimby was a part, is that it held, and you'll find this in the Hermetic literature as well, it held that there is a very thin line of separation between mental experience and spiritual experience. And by spiritual, I mean non-physical. There is a very thin line of separation between that which we think and between the existence of some larger mind or functioning reality or dimension of which we are all a part. A dimension that Louis XVI didn't like to think about because it presented radical ideas of human equality. A dimension that the ancient Greeks called nous, or the overmind. A dimension that Ralph Waldo Emerson called the oversoul. A dimension that Mary Baker Eddy simply referred to as God. Other people have different terms. Some quantum theorists will speak of a unified field. Franz Anton Mesmer spoke of animal magnetism. If you want to call it animal magnetism, be my guest. These are all just vocabulary terms for our efforts to get at the ineffable. But there seems to be, through the experience of many, many seekers over millennia and in the modern era, and well documented in certain studies, which I'll talk about next week, there seems to be a continuity between mental and invisible experience, whatever you call it. And I'm filled with joy at you guys being here tonight, because by being here, it gives us all the opportunity to affirm the existence and the possibility of individual spiritual experiment. It's yours. It's so extraordinary. You know, you don't have to, again, if I may repeat, you don't have to join anything. You don't have to pay anybody. You don't have to put any label on yourself. You don't have to tell anybody you're doing it. In fact, it's better not to tell people you're doing it, because you don't want to talk to your friend Mike, who says, that sounds stupid, you know. We all have a friend Mike, don't we? Don't tell Mike what you're doing. It's not his business. You know, it's not his business. Why? Why is it his business? It's your intimate property. It's your mind. It's beautiful. And again, it puts you in concert with primeval seekers, people who really go back to humanity's earliest strivings to ask, what is out there? Who are we? So that's the journey that we're beginning on this cycle of 3 talks. And I'm so grateful to you all for being here. I wish you all the greatest of experiments. I hope I will see some of you next Monday night, when we are going to get down into the real nitty-gritty and get to some methods that we can use, and use that very night. And you're all going to get a really neat gift. So thank you, guys, very much. And I'll leave time for us to talk. We've got some time for exchange, dialogue, questions. Hey.
I want to apologize for being so fidgety. It's just the
Not at all.
energy in this room, the emotional energy in this room. I could nearly faint. Because what you are basically saying is like you're giving people the keys to power. Like,
That's my wish. That's my wish.
and I mean, I hear you. You know, the silver raven wolf. You know, the commodification
Uh-huh.
of that.
Yeah.
But you're not talking about demonic evocation, but like what you're kind of really putting yourself on the line, giving people like the opportunity to like have control.
That's my wish. That's my wish. And I'm glad you said that, because I also want to say something else. You know, I kind of make these promises to people, and I hope I keep them, that I'll never sell anyone on any bullshit or exaggerations. You know, I don't want to be up here presenting myself as the man with the plan, because I can assure you there are plenty of nights where I go to bed screaming into my pillow, and my wife could tell you, where the ceiling is falling in our apartment, and this one can't sleep, and this thing is happening. The stresses of life get to me as they get to everybody else. But that's why I think it's also so important about the fact that not only do we live under many laws and forces, but our psychology is multifaceted. Our psychology, our emotional life. Next week I'm going to talk about prayer. People sometimes tell you how to pray. Well, you should pray thinking that you already have what you've asked for, and so on and so forth. I don't go in for any of that, because actually I think we are faced with so many stresses in life, and we are faced with emotional difficulties, difficult relationships. I think that sometimes we're overwhelmed, and we're actually not able to use our minds to experiment because of the sheer difficulty of life, and that's reality. But I think that's also where prayer can come in. I think prayer responds to that crisis. I just want to say that, because I'm so grateful for what you're saying, but I don't want anybody to feel that I'm standing up here as some, bright shining knight, because I deal with terrible stresses, and I deal with them in the exact same way that everybody in this room deals with them, sometimes successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully. However, the presence of the causative possibilities of your mind serve as a kind of homing beacon that are always there and that you can always come back to, even when a stress or a difficulty or a relationship or whatever it is exerts a crisis on you. Yes?
You referenced a couple movies, and one came to mind when you were talking about Donald Trump. Have you seen The Founder?
No.
The Founder is the story of Ray Kroc.
Uh-huh. Oh, yes, actually, I have seen that. Yes, I like that movie. Yes.
How he did the positive stuff.
Yes.
But then he turned into a monster.
Yes.
And we have McDonald's today, which is really not good.
Not very healthy. Yeah.
And the question that I have is it possible that so many people on the path,
Yeah.
positive thinking, law of attraction, and so on, can end up being the sort of twisted, grotesque
Well,
like we have with Trump?
with Trump, that's an interesting question. The way I think of it is this. We face ethical questions at every moment of our lives. I mean, someone could be secular and could say, listen, everything that you're describing to me sounds like complete fantasy. I don't go for any of it. But that same person faces the same ethical questions that you and I face when probing the capacities of the mind. I always tell this to people. If the mind and if self-assertion put you on an ethical precipice, the individual, whatever his or her beliefs, is on an ethical precipice all the time. It does seem to raise the stakes, and I do agree that the stakes are higher than what we know. The stakes are higher than what we know. Because if I walk around thinking about something, it's possible that that's having effects in the world in ways that might not be immediately graspable, but are every bit as palpable as if I walked up to somebody and said something hostile or insulting, to that person. So it does raise the stakes. If a person is a sensitive being, and if a person, I think, works with and should always have at his or her back an ethical teaching when working with these ideas, and the Hermetic Literature is an ethical teaching as well. I find that the Hermetica has the same values that you could find running through any say, golden rule ethic. It believes in this radical sense of connection between beings. You should always have an ethical teaching, a hollowed ethical teaching at your back when working with these ideas, because I believe that the individual should become more sensitive to the possibilities and the potentialities of what his or her thoughts do. That's part of the path from my perspective. If Trump or Ray Kroc didn't become more sensitive, and obviously in the case of Trump we have a prime example of someone who didn't, to the causative potentials of his or her mind, then that to me reflects an ethical failure, and all the greater of a failure, because the individual might have some kind of insight, however coarse, that his or her thoughts are very powerful things. But I would say that all of us are standing at an ethical precipice all day long, all the time. Every time we meet another individual, every time we interact with another individual, we're faced with some kind of predicament. What does this person want? Am I going to give this to this person? Is this person making a legitimate request on my time? Am I being fair, to this person? So we're always at an ethical precipice, and I think that this philosophy should give us a heightened sense of the stakes, or we haven't proceeded fully. Yeah, thanks. Hey.
This is kind of going off of what we were just talking about, the distortion of this practice a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm kind of interested if you have anything to say about, at least in my experience, the dissonance that can kind of go on when there's something that, what I think of as like the smaller version of you thinks they want that you don't get.
Yeah.
And you get something that's different that you later understand.
Yeah.
Actually what you needed, and how a lot of like, I guess what you're talking about, like the childishness.
Yeah.
Of the secret type, like.
Yeah.
I don't know, that kind of idea.
That is a wonderful question. I'm going to approach that more fully in our third session, but it's such an imperative question. I'll try to address it as best I'm able now. Firstly, I do think we have perspective. I do think that men and women really do have perspective and really do have the capacity to lay out an ideal for themselves toward which they're moving. Otherwise, we could never really speak authentically of having purpose or aims or goals in life. And I think that that perspective almost has to be cultivated over time. It comes in moments. It comes in moments of exquisite sensitivity, exquisite awareness. Kind of like a moment where you look at somebody and you realize that this person that, maybe, I've hated for 10 years is suddenly just this little child who's really crying out for something, and I haven't been connecting with it. I haven't been realizing. I think these moments of exquisite awareness occur where we really do have perspective. We really do have higher perspective. And I think these moments almost become like lines on a map. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote that if you were to actually look at the journey of a ship, it would seem as if that ship were zigzagging and kind of going all over the place. But if you could actually look from a higher perspective, you would see that what actually seems to be happening is manifesting ultimately in a kind of arc that's very purposeful and that has a very certain direction to it. I think the same is true with our own sensitivities. I think these exquisite moments of sensitivity over time manifest like the zigzagging of a ship, which seen from above suddenly becomes this very purposeful, meaningful line. There are childish moments. There are plenty of moments where I think to myself, oh, I wanted that seat on the Titanic. If only I had just gotten to the ticket office 10 minutes earlier, then I'd be happy. And we're not possessed of perspective all the time. We're not possessed of perspective all the time. It's, again, I think one of these inconsistencies that we have to accept in life, and that we have to accept not only as paradox, but as a basic part of our existence. There are times where our perspective fails us because it's an appetite. But there are other times where it comes from these exquisite moments of sensitivity that I think we're granted. And I think over time, the sensitive individual really does have perspective and can announce within him or herself, this is really what I want. This is my purpose. This is my dharma, however you put it. Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
You said that a lot of these, you talked about how these thoughts have a thread back to, in this case, ancient Egypt, the Hermetic tradition, to today, and the positive thoughts. What she just mentioned, and a couple things you mentioned, have so many parallels with, seems like with Buddhism
Uh-huh.
and illusion.
Yeah.
And there is the notion of the Dharma there, but I was wondering, the Hermetic tradition and everything, that's all the West, so to speak. And yet it has so many parallels.
Yeah.
Is there a similar thread in the East, or did they crisscross more than we're aware?
I think, well, I'm really glad you used the word parallel, because that's, I think, what's going on. There are certain historic parallels. I think you'll find these ideas sometimes with different shades of emphasis within the Vedic tradition, within the Buddhist tradition. You find it within Judaism. You find it within Christianity. I've actually been really astonished at how certain voices from deep within Hasidic or Orthodox Judaism will talk about causative layers, causative abilities of the mind. In that particular instance, it's also married to a liturgy that might seem very unapproachable or even unnecessary, to a certain individual. You'll find the same within Buddhism, with the same within the Vedic tradition, with shades of difference, I think that the modern variant, quite frankly, the modern variant that I'm talking about, it is affirming of goal attainment. It is affirming of goal attainment, of achievement. The idea not just being that you are transcending desire, but the idea being that the world in which you function and express yourself is holy in itself, is expressive and is reflective in itself of the highest. I think you would find a slightly different emphasis within Buddhism, within the Vedic tradition. And I'll try to talk more about that next week because, I personally believe that we folks living here in the 21st century in the modern West, we have to be very careful with terms like non-attachment and understand, exactly what we're talking about and where they come from and where they spring from, because we have been raised, very heavily in an atmosphere that is achievement-oriented. And I'm not saying that critically. I'm not saying that critically. I think that when Christ spoke of, there being two worlds that we live in, one the transcendent, one the world of Caesar, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, I'm not sure that that's necessarily a statement in the negative towards the world that we live in. I think one could say the world that we live in and the unseen world are both one and the same. Each is reflective of the other. They're part of a whole. So I'm not necessarily criticizing an achievement-oriented ethos, although I honor that there are some traditions where that ethos is held to question. So you would find, and I'm very glad you used the word parallel, because these things are not necessarily all part of one neat family tree. The folks who were devising New Thought philosophy in America, for example, many of them lived in very modest circumstances, very rural circumstances. They didn't have access to Vedic literature, certainly not to translations of the Hermetica. They might have just had the King James Bible in their household and their own personal willingness to experiment. And the fact that they arrived at parallel insights in some cases is extraordinary. I mean, you could read certain things in Mary Baker Eddy that run parallel to certain ideas within Buddhism, and it's really quite remarkable. She grew up in a rural New England household with really just a couple of books around, and it's funny, we think of this stuff as having all been available, but the first English translation of the Tao Te Ching wasn't until 1838. It's estimated, there was a historian who estimated that in 1845, just a few years after Ralph Waldo Emerson published his first series of essays, there were only 5 copies of the Bhagavad Gita in English in the United States as a whole. One was in Emerson's private library, which he loaned out to Thoreau and so on. One was in the library at Harvard, and 3 were in private hands. So the folks that were kind of blazing this trail didn't necessarily even have access in any conventional way to some of these ideas. So they were parallel insights, differing with shades of difference. But it's remarkable to me that people separated by vast differences in geography and culture will sometimes arrive at parallel insights. It's very alluring.
The emphasis on Golitin, why that more in the West?
Well, we've always grown up that way. This nation itself was, in addition to being, an experiment in religious freedom, was things many shades uglier and crueler than that, and of course did also develop a consumer culture, which led to, or fed into at least, a spirit of acquisitiveness. And one could look at the limitations of that and look at the ethical problems of that, while I think also respecting and questioning the degree to which individual attainment is a reflection of the higher in the individual. The artist who's striving to get his or her work just beautifully, perfectly honed, or the person, quite frankly, who's starting a business and who wishes with everything inside him or her that this business succeed and find its way. I think that could be an expression of the most beautiful, highest content of human life. Hey.
I'm standing because I've spent too many hours sitting on a plane coming from Spain myself.
Oh. You win longest commute, I'm just biking up the block.
This extremely interesting. This is my first time. I didn't know your work. Thanks to Angel in this case.
Thank you.
Of course, he's always pointing me in the right direction, definitely. So we were actually chatting about this upstairs in regards to the ancient religion of Zarathustra.
Mm-hmm.
I see to notice the aspects of Pohumano, one of the 7 Spentamanios,
Mm-hmm.
Buddhavasta in this case, or the creator himself, that he's not a creator as you would see in the Abrahamic revelation,
Mm-hmm.
but more of a titan.
Yeah.
And that means being inverted. That means that it is an heroic religion,
Mm-hmm.
and that these comes exactly from the responsibility of growing and going and moving forward.
Yes.
Okay, that's an observation.
Yeah.
One question is, it's a tricky question. I'd like to hear your take on that. Is, are we bodies or do we have bodies?
That's a
Because
fascinating
I'm hearing the
question.
word transcendency there.
What a beautiful question. Are we bodies or do we have bodies? That's a beautiful, beautiful question. You find the sense in the Hermetic literature that the body belongs to the mind. The mind does not belong to the body, which is a sort of different way entering your point. Are we bodies or do we have bodies? I was thinking of the Hermetic literature as you were describing this insight from the Zoroastrian faith, because I think within Hermeticism, and part of the reason I love it so much, is that, the writers within it, all of whom were anonymous, and they did not always agree. It wasn't some sort of a neat congregational doctrine. But I think you find insights, African, Egyptian, Persian, and Greek insights. And I think that the Hermetic literature, in trying to sort of unpack the very beautiful point that you were just raising, suggests that the mind doesn't belong to the body. The body belongs to the mind. So the insights of the scribes and the visionaries who wrote that literature, I think would coalesce with the aspect of your question, with the aspect of your observation, that we are not bodies but have bodies, that there's something else. In the Hermetic literature, they refer to it as mind. Somebody else might refer to it as soul, somebody else Atman, somebody else, higher self, what have you. But I think it's the affirmation that we don't just lead physical existences. Although, of course, I think one must venerate the physical, because it's so precious, and it's given to us for a finite amount of time, and we won't be here, such and such number of decades from now, unless something else takes life from us first. So I venerate both. I couldn't suggest to you that even the beautiful insight that our bodies belong to our minds liberates me from feeling that the body is precious, as is the mind. I hope that's helpful. All right. Hey. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I definitely don't see it as separate. I mean, that's a fascinating question. I see witchcraft as, we call it witchcraft today, of course, but it's a melange of ancient, nature-based, seasonally based beliefs that, you could say it ran through Europe, but one could say it ran through all lands and all countries and all cultures, where the seasons were observed and where agriculture was really the dividing line of one's existence. Every ancient person, I think really the start of all civilizations probably began with some sort of an agricultural system and a parallel religious and ethical set of observances that venerated that agricultural system, including the changing of the cycles of nature and so on. And it seems to me that the wish of all ancient people was to come into contact with some higher sense of possibility within themselves, without themselves, so that they didn't feel completely set adrift into the vagaries of whether rain would arrive in the right season, or whether a certain crop would survive or not survive, which could be the literal difference between life and death. And for some who practice what we today might call Wicca or neo-paganism or what have you, there was a tremendous veneration of the seasons, and I think a wish to appeal to whether one calls it deity or a higher intelligence that might be an intercessory force. I see it as part of the same conversation. It's just, again, it's sort of different vocabulary, different reference points. You know, I mean, Mesmer could speak of animal magnetism, somebody else could speak of an oversoul, a practitioner of the ancient nature faiths could speak of higher spirit and feel a sense of continuation between themselves and that spirit, and I think that person would be enacting some of the very same things that we're talking about here. You know, does that help?
Yeah. Yeah. I think what I'm
I mean, it's about a connection to some vaster, non-physical form of life, which one might apply symbols to, which could be very valid, but another person could say mind, you know, with a capital M perhaps, or in other cases not, but they could be having the same conversation, you know. Does that make sense? Yeah. Thank you. I think one more, and then we're going to skedaddle. So anybody else? Hey.
So I have a question on the name of today's talk.
Yeah.
So it's
Oh, yes. Right.
our cause and effect.
Yeah.
So hearing you unpack that,
Yeah.
it became clear to me that emotions are also causative.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you started to talk
Yes.
about Donald Trump, a person who's completely overrun by his emotions,
Yes.
and that seeing the ways in which he's been able to apply this philosophy,
Yeah.
simultaneously being a master of the philosophy and being a slave.
Yes.
And it's all focused on the emotion.
Yes.
So my question is, why did you choose to highlight thoughts as being positive instead of emotions or thoughts and emotions?
Yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful question. I speak in terms of thoughts being causative because I think thoughts represent an effort on our part to direct the emotions, one which is not always successful. And as I think you've alluded very wisely in your statement, thoughts and emotions are, of course, two different things. And I'm glad you brought this up because it can be a pitfall to try to speak of thoughts and emotions synonymously or as if they're one and the same. I have an emotional life, I have a mental life, I have a physical life, and these things are all running on parallel tracks and sort of doing their own things. A physical craving might not be controllable under the urges of intellect. An emotional outburst might not be controllable under the agency of intellect. But I do think thought, or some would call it consciousness, I would call it awareness, is an effort to sort of have a master of the house present in a certain sense. If one, and we'll talk about this in next week's methods, if one were to say that an emotionalized picture can be a vehicle of causation, my way of arriving at that emotionalized picture would be first through setting an intention. So in that sense, one tries to make thought into the steerman. One tries to make thought into that which is holding the wheel of self, of which there is so much else going on. But I think that emotionalized thoughts, as I think you're alluding in your statement, are kind of the royal road to all possibility. Because if it's just thoughts going on by themselves without the emotions acting in concert, at least part of the time, then I'm in pieces. Then I'm just in pieces. But awareness or thought, one hopes to be the helmsman, which is why I lead with that idea. Thank you. And thank you guys all. I hope I'll see you next week. Take care. Good night. Thank you. Thank you.